Dalian niyo na mga anak, malapit na tayong kumain. Pauwi na din ang tatay niyo.
Kamusta naman ang araw niyo?
Maayos naman po, Tay. Sinabi po sa school na magkakaroon daw ng eleksyon sa bar ngayong taon?
Oo anak, pumunta ako sa 𝐿𝐴𝐚𝐲 𝐏𝐚𝐻𝐿 kanina. Ipinaliwanag sa pinuntahan ko na ang eleksyon sa BARM ay matutuloy na ngayong taon. Ang kauna-unang BARM Parliamentary Elections ay magaganap ngayong October 13, 2025.
Ano po ang bar parliamentary elections?
Sa BARM Parliamentary, pipili tayo ng 80 na miyembro ng BARM Parliament. Ang 80 na pipiliin natin ay magmumula sa Regional Parliamentary Political Party, Parliamentary District Representatives, at iba't ibang sektor.
Ano po ang ibig sabihin ng parliamentary?
Ang natutunan ko, sa isang parliamentary government, binoboto ang mga miyembro ng parlamento. Kapag nahalal sila, pipiliin ng mga miyembro ng parlamento wala sa kanila ang pinuno ng gobyerno. Sa kaso ng BARM, ito ang Chief Minister.
Ang BARM, nabuo siya sa pamamagitan ng Bangsamoro Organic Law at bahagi ito ng peace agreement ng pamahalaan at liderato ng Bangsamoro para bigyan ang rehiyon ng karapatang mamahala nang naayon sa kanilang pagkakakilanlan at pagkatao. Matagal na itong pinagtrabahuhan bago ka pa pinanganak. Pinili ng Bangsamoro ang parlamentong uri na pamamahala upang sila ay magkaroon ng makabuluhang boses pang siwa ng kanilang teritoryo na naaayon sa kanilang tradisyon at kultura. Isa pang mahalagang bagay, may batas laban sa political dynasty sa BARM. Kaya rin hinihikayat ang mga grupo na bumuo ng partido na nakatuon sa prinsipyo at advokasya at hindi lamang sa apelyido ng tumatakbo.
Ibig sabihin po ba kahit hindi ako mula sa kilalang pamilya, may pag-asa akong maging leader sa BARM?
Oo, bahagi ito ng kwalifikasyon ng nominee sa Regional Parliamentary Political Party.
Maaari na po ba akong bumoto?
Ilang taong ka na ba? Basta ikaw ay 18 taong gulang na, syempre dapat ay Pilipino at residente ng BARM. Pwede kang bumoto.
Pero 16 ka pa lang anak, sa 2028 ka pa makakaboto.
Sa susunod, kapag maparehistro ka na, pwede mong ilagay na miyembro ka ng sektor ng kabataan at kababaihan.
Oo nga anak, sa 𝐿𝐴𝐚𝐲 Voter Education, binigyang diin din nila na bawat Regional Parliamentary Political Party dapat may 12 kababaihan sa kanilang listahan ng nominees.
Makaboboto ka para sa mga reserve seats nila, kasama ng pagboto sa Regional Parliamentary Political Party at Parliamentary District Representatives.
Ibig sabihin, marami pong babae ang pwedeng maging miyembro ng parliament?
Tama anak, dahil dito, makasiguro tayo na mas maraming perspektiba ang maririnig sa pamamahala, lalo na sa mga isyung may direktang makakaapekto sa kababaihan.
Nanay, sa voter education, lamagit po ba na gagamit tayo ng makina sa botohan? Kasi naranasan ko sa barangay at SK election walang makina.
Oo, gagamit tayo ng makina. Sa balota, makikita rin natin ang logo ng mga Regional Parliamentary Political Party at ang larawan ng mga kandidato. Sa Oktubre, pipili tayo ng isang regional parliamentary political party at isang tao na magsisilbing parliamentary district representative.
Pipili tayo ng partido para mabuo ang 40 seats. Sa parliamentary district representative naman, tao ang iboboto. May 32 districts sa BARM. Iba pa ito sa legislative o congressional districts.
Teka, hindi po tayo boboto ng sectoral representatives?
Di po ba may 80 seats? Para saan po ang walong natitira?
Yung 8 seats para sa sectoral representatives. Tama ba na hindi pa tayo makaboboto ng sectoral representatives?
Hindi pa. Sa 2028 pa tayo makakaboto ng sectoral representatives. Para sa 2025, internal assemblies daw muna ito.
Nakakatuwa naman na sabik kang bumoto. Paraan ito upang makilahok sa pagpili ng mga namumuno sa atin. Gamitin natin ang pagkakataon na binibigay ng eleksyon upang mas maging aktibo sa pagbuo ng ating pamahalaan na tapat at maglilingkod sa ating mga mamamayan.
Good evening to all our viewers and welcome to the 22nd episode of May Papel Ka, hashtag Satin ang Eleksyon. This is our monthly civic engagement series brought to you by Lente Philippines and Tayo Na Collaboratory for Young Leaders of Democracy. Good evening, everyone. I'm Jules Giang, your host for tonight. Here with us in tonight's episode are our FSL interpreters. We have Charlon Hamero and Adeline Orzco, our sign language interpreters. Friends, in this episode, we will look at what lies ahead following the suspension of preparations for the 2025 Bangsamoro parliamentary elections. Now, with the Supreme Court's issuance of a temporary restraining order against the Bangsamoro Autonomy Act or BAA 77 and the subsequent suspension of COMELEC's preparatory activities, we once again bring together our guest speakers to unpack the implications of these developments. This discussion is especially urgent as we are only 17 days away from Election Day. This election is historic. It's not only the first parliamentary election in the Bangsamoro, but also a milestone in the region's journey toward self-governance. All the more reason why it is vital to ensure that every voter is well informed about their rights and prepared to participate in this new electoral process. We have a great deal to cover tonight, so let us begin. It is my honor to introduce our esteemed guest speakers. Firstly, we have the chairperson of the Government of the Philippines Negotiating Panel, Ms. Miriam Coronel Ferrer. Hi, Ma'am Miriam. Good evening.
Magandang gabi sa inyo, Jules. Thank you for this opportunity to discuss this critical issue. At salamat din sa inyo sa inyong education campaign kasi hindi ganun kadali maintindihan yung electoral process sa Bangsamoro.
Yes, that's right, Ms. Miriam. So this is our way basically to unpack all the information that we need to relay to our audiences. Thank you, Ms. Miriam. Aside from Ms. Miriam, we also have the country representative of the Asia Foundation Philippines and member of the third-party monitoring team. We have Mr. Sam Chitik. Hi, Mr. Sam. Good evening.
Thanks, Jules. Nice to be with you.
It's our pleasure. And of course, joining in the panel this evening, we have the Director for BARM Reforms and Advocacy of Lente Philippines. We have Attorney Carlo Africa. Attorney Af, good evening to you.
Magandang gabi po sa ating lahat. Excited na po ako, pag-usapan yung lahat na kailangan pag-usapan tonight.
We're equally excited, and thank you so much for being here despite the possible impact of the typhoon, which is happening right now, and we also pray that everyone is safe. But before we proceed to our discussion, we have a few reminders for our dear viewers. Of course, our online audience may also take part in tonight's conversation. We invite all of you to join the discussion by sending messages to our hotlines flashed on your screens right now. And if you have comments or questions, please feel free to leave a comment down below and we will answer them with our guests. Also, don't forget to like and share our episode tonight and use the hashtag #satin ang eleksyon. So let's start with the discussion. We'll first discuss the legal and institutional impacts of the TRO. We start with Attorney Af. Attorney Af, from a legal and electoral perspective, what exactly does the Supreme Court's TRO on BAA 77 mean? And why do you think COMELEC has suspended preparations but kept the campaign and election period in effect?
So I think it'll be good for us to understand what the legal framework is right now when it comes to redistricting. So BA 77 repealed, in essence, the initial districting law, which is BAA 58. So because of this process, there are people who were not happy with the way it was processed or with the final provisions of this law. So they filed with the Supreme Court challenging its constitutionality. And then the Supreme Court finding merit, and part of that case is that they asked for a temporary restraining order to be granted as well. So to keep COMELEC from actually continuing with the election, considering everything that has happened. So the Supreme Court found merit in the TRO, so they granted the TRO. So why is this important? So because BAA 77 repealed BAA 58, there is now a little bit of uncertainty as to what happens when it comes to the election, particularly with the districting seats. But the problem here is that COMELEC was also enjoined from the enforcement of BAA 77. Which means COMELEC right now has its hands tied when it comes to the district, with the seats for the district representatives. So, kaya nakita natin, COMELEC really, it was hard for them to actually continue with the operations. So what they did was they halted operations as a whole. But recently, they also came out with another resolution saying that other operations as to security and as to election aspects were continuing. And I think what happened there was that in terms of internal operations, they're halting, but everything external, they're continuing with that process. So right now, COMELEC is trying to juggle a couple of things, still thinking about elections as a whole, but also trying to also make sense of what they can do considering the Supreme Court order to really stop everything when it comes to the the seats for the district representatives.
Thanks, Attorney Af, for explaining that point. Now we go to Ma'am Ferrer. Ma'am, from a peace process and negotiation standpoint, do you see the Supreme Court's TRO on the BAA 77 affecting the overall implementation of this comprehensive agreement on the Bangsamoro or the CAB?
I think we have to accept that that has been the turn of events, that you're already in this kind of situation. But as of now, that's a critical question. Will there be an election on October 13 or not? Which is very much part of really moving from a transitory Bangsamoro parliament to one that is elected. So in that sense, the implementation is affected because if you are also going to the implementation of all the other aspects are affected, because if you're going to stop one process, especially at the time when already there's a lot of tension relating to the relationship between OPAPRU and the MILF led by Chairman Murad, then which has led to the suspension of decommissioning, you're actually the process has actually been prolonged, too prolonged, in fact, and that affects everything. It creates instability in the meantime.
Thank you, Ms. Miriam. Now we go to Mr. Sam Chitik. Sir Sam, from your standpoint, the third-party monitoring team, or as we call as the TPMT, is currently undertaking its 55th monitoring mission to review the state of the peace process. So how is the TRO on the BAA 77 and the suspension of election preparations shaping the overall trajectory of the Bangsamoro transition?
Well, as Miriam just mentioned, it's essentially putting a halt to the next step. The next critical step is the election. One of the beautiful things about this process, what makes it fundamentally sound, is it's rooted in democracy, in democratic process. The original negotiation between a rebel group and the state, the Republic of the Philippines, was executive. It was the president of the Republic, series of presidents of the Republic, from Cory Aquino onwards, negotiating with a rebel group. That's an executive level discussion. But the intention was that it's always within the democratic process of the Philippines. And ultimately, part of the transition or the translation of that is to go to the people to elect their representatives. We've not had that yet. We had a plebiscite in 2019 to ratify the law, which is the implementation, parts of implementation of the comprehensive agreement of the Bangsamoro. But you're still lacking that last step, which is asking the people who do they want to represent them in the regional parliament. And so that's the part that's on pause at the moment. From my perspective, having been an observer of the process for quite a long time, I think the sooner the better for the election, because it allows the people their vote. There are, Carla was mentioning before, some of the issues COMELEC is dealing with. There are logistical administrative challenges with respect to the TRO. But they shouldn't get in the way of deciding on the nearest possible date to have this election.
Thank you, Mr. Sam. Now, from talking about the legal and institutional impacts of the TRO, we now talk about the representation and inclusivity in the elections. So now we go back to you, Attorney Af. Attorney, what possible scenarios should we anticipate if the TRO remains in place? So the postponement, rescheduling, or conducting elections under the old redistricting law? Or which of these basically pose the least or most risk legally?
So I think so we have to understand what the order of the Supreme Court was. So we just released our own statement this morning. The statement specifically, the TRO specifically enjoined COMELEC from enforcing BAA 77. So our belief is that right now, if you look at the legal framework, because the law, the RA 12123, establishes October 13 as the election date, in our position as Lente right now is that elections must push through on October 13, because nowhere in the TRO was it found that they enjoined COMELEC from actually enforcing that Republic Act. So our statement, our position right now is that as to the district representatives, we will await the further orders from the Supreme Court. But as to the party seats in the district representatives, our position is that elections must push through in October 13. Because the legal framework right now, we have the Bangsamoro Electoral Code that allows this election to actually push through on October 13. So there's no legal impediment, there's no legal obstacle for that elections to actually push through. But this is also considering that Supreme Court will not have a decision before October 13. So I think the ideal scenario for us really is for the Supreme Court to act with haste when it comes to deciding this matter and having a very clear resolution as to or instructions for COMELEC on how to move forward with the elections for October 13. Again, the problem right now is we have a Republic Act, a national law, requiring elections to actually happen on October 13. There's no law, there's no position right now. For you to amend that, you need another law. For you, if you want to postpone, COMELEC will not have the power to postpone that election because they only have the power to postpone specific political subdivisions. So pwede lang sila mag-postpone at the level of city or municipality or barangay due to very specific circumstances, whether there's flooding, there's a violence. But in our minds, this TRO is not one of those circumstances, because the, the the grounds for a TRO to pass requires unforeseen circumstances. And in our minds, this contentious issue, the fact that there was filing, the fact that the TRO was actually filed, could have actually been foreseen. So going back to 2020, even before the pandemic, there was so much contention around districting. So in our experience with working with the Bangsamoro Transition Authority, we knew there were many interests and many considerations in mind in developing this law, specifically this districting law. It was actually also strategic on our part in making sure that you pass the Bangsamoro Electoral Code. The Bangsamoro Electoral Code was passed before the districting law, because if we had to wait for the districting law, it would have further delayed the passage of the Bangsamoro Electoral Code in itself. So it was very clear, it's very public, that there was so much contention around the districting. So in our minds, this cannot fall under the category of unforeseen. Hence, it cannot be used by COMELEC to actually postpone the election as a whole, specifically, and even specifically with the districting. So I think that's a problem that we do have. I think the problem of, if we do postpone elections on October 13, this will be a big issue, because again, the law is very clear. The Public Act 12123 is very clear that elections must happen October 13. I am not sure, if the Supreme Court is unable to give a decision by then, what actually happens, because then COMELEC will be in violation of the law of the Public Act 123. So that will be a problem on its own. I would imagine that the hope is that Supreme Court would really lay down guidelines moving forward. And we do understand, we believe that the Supreme Court is aware of all of these issues. And we hope that the guidelines, after we really pave a very clear line for all stakeholders, not just COMELEC, but also the political parties and stakeholders such as us and our voters, when it comes to how do we really make sure that we have legal stability when it comes to having election, the first Bangsamoro parliamentary elections.
Thanks,
If I may
Attorney
add,
Af. Yeah, go ahead.
yes. Okay. So we know that COMELEC is in a bind, right? Because of all of these implications that Attorney Africa just mentioned, whichever way the Supreme Court decision goes. But I would think that the most prudent thing for COMELEC to do is to continue with the preparations, not to go ahead or speak ahead of what the Supreme Court will eventually say between now and October 13, because it has the obligation, the mandate to conduct elections on October 13. So it's very ironic that they allow the continuation of the other aspects of the process, such as campaigning, all the security requirements, the ban on guns, and so on. But on the other hand, stop their internal preparation. Kasi what if next week the Supreme Court says, go ahead with the election, either only with the with the sectoral representation and the reserved seats, or precisely upholding the old law, or even just the new law. But the instruction is to go ahead with the election. Then how will COMELEC be able to comply with that if they did not continue the preparation? I think it's wrong to telegraph to the Supreme Court in a way that you are not ready, because then in a way you may be trying to influence how the Supreme Court will be acting on this. So we all know that everything rests on what the Supreme Court says next. The Supreme Court should also have been more explicit, and I can say that without fear of since I'm not a lawyer, it could have been more explicit as to the implications of the TRO that they did. Although it's very clear from what they issued, they did not say suspend the election. There's no order to suspend the election. There's only a TRO on the implementation of BAA 77. So, but you're already there. You're already in that situation. So what must COMELEC do in that kind of situation? Then it must continue the preparation so that whichever way Supreme Court eventually rules on this or qualifies, not yet rule, maybe not really discuss all the constitutional issues that were raised in the petition, but at the very least, for example, say that you go back to the status quo ante, whether the status quo ante is 58 or whether it is 77, then you will still have the election. What if? No? So where will COMELEC find itself by stopping the preparation? It's its obligation to be able to administer the election, since after all that is still the national law. And I mean on October 13 and not on some other
Thanks,
day.
Yeah. Right. Thanks, Ms. Miriam. That's a very good take on the practical side. But on the principle side, the CAB emphasized inclusivity and democratic representation as the cornerstones of this Bangsamoro transition. But still, in light of the TRO and possible election postponement, what risks do you see for these principles, and probably what lessons from the negotiation table might guide the stakeholders right now?
Well, the whole notion of inclusivity precisely rests on having the election according to the representation system that has been put up, first on the basis of the agreement and then eventually on the Bangsamoro Organic Law. I think the representation system there is much, much more democratic than what you have in the National Congress. National Congress, 2% party list. Here you have 40%, 50%, 40%, no, 40% or 50%. I'm confused now. But you have a much bigger percentage, 40%, because 10% goes to the reserve seats. And then you only have the rest as the district representation. So I think that's what the law intended, to have a more representative government, to have power sharing on the basis of political parties, to have genuine political parties, because even the electoral code that the Bangsamoro passed says it basically bans turncoatism. You can't just move from one party to another. So I think a lot of the elements, except for the issue of the redistricting, are already there to precisely ensure much better, a more representative Bangsamoro Parliament that is elected by the people through precisely this first election that will happen now in the Bangsamoro.
Thanks, Ms. Miriam. Now for Mr. Sam. Sir Sam, in your monitoring, what concerns are you hearing so far from our key stakeholders like the Bangsamoro government, the national government, and of course the communities about the uncertainty in the electoral timeline so far?
Right. So the third-party monitoring team was established in 2013, and it has a mandate, an official mandate from the government and the MILF. And it picked up from lessons from other peace processes where over time, it's hard to keep attention on what was actually agreed. So our job, I am one of 5 members of the TPMT, our job is to monitor and report. So we monitor the implementation of the comprehensive agreement on the Bangsamoro, not so much responsible for the politics side of it, if you like. And of course, this process, what we're discussing here with the completion of the election or the pausing of the election, has a direct impact on that peace process. So when we're wandering around this week asking questions of stakeholders, what we hear back is what you mentioned: uncertainty, confusion, some fears as well. People are really ready, I think, for that next step of political representation. And people realize that the peace process still has a ways to go. The security side of it, the normalization, there are things that are incomplete. Even on the governing side, there are still things that are incomplete. There's a revenue code which still has to be completed. But by and large, people are, I think, comfortable and ready to elect representatives. And that will really finish what's known as the political track of the process. And then focus can switch to finishing the normalization track, really completing in a fulsome and comprehensive way the normalization track. But of course, we can't do that if the wheels keep spinning, if we don't actually if we don't take these steps forward. So what we're hearing is concern, confusion. Underpinning it all, what is really interesting to me is there is still a fundamental optimism that this process is going to deliver some of the positive outcomes that people are looking for. They want their own voice and representation. They want some of the issues and difficulties to be resolved at a regional level and not have to pass all the time to Manila. And they want that, local decision making is made by people who they associate with, they have a relationship with, they have some kind of electoral affinity with. So I don't think it's all negative at the moment. I think there is still those little threads of optimism when you talk to the community, but it's obviously being very tested at the moment.
Thanks, Sir Sam. Now let's zero in on trust confidence building. Back to Attorney Af. Attorney, civil society group like Lente play a key role in safeguarding the integrity of the election. So from your perspective, what safeguards or transparency measures should be prioritized now to prevent erosion of public trust during this uncertain period?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest issues that we have, not just for the Bangsamoro elections, but elections overall in the Philippines, is that we've gotten used to postponements. So the Bangsamoro elections has been postponed multiple times. Even the predecessor of BARM, ARMM, there were multiple postponements of those elections. For the Barangay SK elections, the Supreme Court already told our Congress that you cannot postpone elections anymore. But here we are again waiting for the decision of the Supreme Court on whether the newest law extending the term limits of the current Bangsamoro Barangay SK officials are actually valid. So I think this erodes public trust when it comes to the electoral process, because now people are not sure. There's always a question of whether elections will actually push through. And again, the point of elections is not just for us to elect leaders and representatives. It's for people to be able to have the opportunity to express their political will. So absent this process, absent this periodic and genuine process, it becomes harder for people to actually have trust in the system that is in place. So as Lente, it has always been our advocacy to ensure, to call for our public lawmakers to, as much as possible, let's make sure that elections are periodic. So again, in our mind, it's very clear that the law is clear. Elections should push through in October 13. So that's what we're pushing for. And as Lente, our goal is that we'll act as if it will push through, because it should push through. So part of the challenge right now is really making sure that people are aware of the election. So the biggest challenge when it comes to BARM voters is not a lot of voters still know there's an election, or even the form of government for the Bangsamoro. And really, our role as civil society is to make sure that as much as possible, more and more of our voters are really aware, so that come election time, they are able to fully exercise the right to suffrage. So there's two things here. One is really public awareness, but I think the biggest role of Lente and civil society organizations as a whole is really to call out our government institutions to make sure that elections should continuously push through.
Thanks, Attorney Af. Ma'am Miriam, when you led the peace negotiations, part of the vision was a smooth transition from armed struggle to democratic governance. So how might the uncertainty in the electoral timeline impact the trust and confidence of stakeholders, especially with the MILF, former combatants in local communities?
Well, we have to see it in a longer context, because the controversies now and the crisis as we see it now actually have began much earlier. With, for example, first, of course, we saw the Supreme Court decision saying that Sulu should leave, basically, should not be part of the BARM. And that precisely creates the issues about redistricting and everything, right? And that was way back in November. And then you begin to, if you look on hindsight, you might ask, well, if that was already the case, they should have prepared much earlier for all of these implications on the seats, the BTA's, the Bangsamoro Parliament seats. Either, if you look back, they could have asked Congress, instead of postponing the elections, to amend the law. Perhaps then you don't need 80 seats in the parliament. Maybe you can adjust it to the fact that you're losing one major province And that won't be in violation of the agreement because the agreement only said that at least 50 seats. It was the law that said 80 seats. And therefore, it's also Congress who can modify that, of course, with the cooperation and collaboration of the major stakeholders, especially the Bangsamoro Parliament and the MILF at that time. But what we see are a series of developments that really sort of like upset everything and put everything in a like hanging, basically hanging. First, it was the issue of postponing election in January, February this year. Then you have the issue of replacing the chief minister sometime in March, right? Which is of course contested as whether in fact this was a purely internal decision or it was something that was done based on the influence of external actors. And then afterwards, you had the controversy of the appointments of the Bangsamoro, precisely the Bangsamoro Parliament, where again, you violated both the agreement and the law when it came to the final appointments in the Bangsamoro Parliament. So it's all of these series of events that have happened throughout that is really like the formula for this kind of crisis that we are facing now. And once again, the Supreme Court is stepping in and it has to step up in realizing the kind of crisis that is brewing in the meantime that everything has been put on hold.
Thank you so much, Ms. Miriam. For Sir Sam, the TPMT has consistently stressed that trust among parties is at of this 2025 elections further affect the fragile.
You were breaking up a little bit there, Jules, but the question of trust is fundamental. It's not this transition period and difficulties in completing an agreement is not unique to the Bangsamoro. Peace processes around the world, ever since they've been created, have had this difficulty. It's a difficult, complex, complicated process. What needs to hold together to see the end of this process in a positive way is the fundamental trust which exists between the parties needs to be continually reinforced. And it's reinforced through direct dialogue, conversation, the day-to-day interactions between the government and the MILF. There are ways in which both parties can contribute to moving things forward. Underpinning all of it has to be the sense that this process is bigger than any one individual. This process is bigger than the institutions themselves. The process is really about the future of the Philippine state and particularly about the Bangsamoro region. And as long as people keep that in mind, I don't think there's anything so far that cannot be overcome or resolved. But it takes continual application, continual attention, continual investment of political will in order to see it through these obstacles, which invariably come up in a process, particularly one which is running now 11 years since the signing of the comprehensive agreement. I still think there's an opportunity for this administration to finish in a really meaningful, comprehensive way this agreement. They have 2.5 years left for the end of President Marcos's term. I would still argue that there is an opportunity for the administration to be the shepherds that see the end of this process together with their counterparts on. But of course, that requires joint action and joint commitment to continue to see it through what was originally a joint agreement, or which continues to be a joint agreement.
Thank you, Sam. I'd like to ask our guest. Sorry.
Go ahead.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Sorry, my Wi-Fi is a bit lagging right now, probably because of the winds outside. But now we go further to the latter part of the interview. We close it by talking about the safeguarding of the transition and moving forward. I'd like to firstly ask Ms. Miriam. Ms. Miriam, delays in elections definitely create frustrations among different parties and election stakeholders. So based on your experience as a negotiator, what strategies or confidence-building measures can we help prevent these legal and potential political hurdles from weakening the commitments of both the government and the MILF to the peace agreement?
Well, as Sam has said, it's really built. It has to really be built again in the panels, the implementing panels, to really start to talk again, and then build the confidence, and really see everything in the light of a desire to be able to to be able to complete the process, and be able to renew the commitment. But again, that really requires rebuilding the trust and confidence in the whole process. So right now we don't know. It's still possible, if the election is postponed on October 13, that it might happen within 30 days, which is the requirement, right? After, and assuming, of course, the Supreme Court has already given its provided the parameters for the next steps. So it's going to happen. It's going to happen. The elections will happen, and unless you change the law, it cannot be postponed much longer. Because strictly speaking, things have to be the election has to happen, unless either a few months later or just a month later. Am I right, Attorney Africa? You postpone an election based on force majeure, which is, of course, questionable what force majeure means in this instance, what the act of God refers to in this case, right? But in any case, you need to continue with the election within 30 days, right? So
Yes.
during the time period, there has to be a decision, clear clarity on the fate of either BAA 77 or 58. Then the remedies that will have to be done in terms of the ballot and everything, and holding of the election within 30 days after it has been postponed, in accordance with the law, right? So, and that's why the COMELEC really is putting itself in a more complicated position by saying now that it cannot prepare, right? Because in the end, it will have to hold the election unless it pushes Congress, which is now in a crisis itself, to pass a new law setting a different date for the election, sometime next year, sometime in 2028 or whatever, but not within the 30-day requirements after you postpone an election. So you can see here that while the COMELEC fears it might violate a law by pushing through with the preparation, it should foresee that it will put itself in a more complicated position if it does not actually prepare for the possibility of the election happening on October 13 or within 30 days afterwards.
Right. And just to clarify, right, so if the Supreme Court rules that 77, the new districting law, is invalid, the election can go ahead within 30 days because it's already organized on the basis of the old districts. But if the Supreme Court rules that BAA 77 is valid, even with some modifications, then they need to do a refiling of candidacies. They need to, there's a longer process that COMELEC will have to go through, which means they would not be able to meet the 30-day requirement. It'd be practically impossible for them to do that. So as you mentioned earlier, Miriam, a lot is hanging on what that Supreme Court ruling will specify.
Thank you so much, Ms. Miriam and Sir Sam, for that input. But additional question for you, Mr. Sam, from the perspective of international partners who follow the TPMT's findings very closely, how episode of confidence?
You broke up, Jules.
So the question is about the perspective of international partners. There has been a long-term international commitment to this peace process. I'm a member of the third-party monitoring team together with a colleague from the EU, a colleague from Turkey, Philippine colleagues. There are many other countries that are invested in the process in various different mechanisms. And I think it's fair to say the international community has been heavily invested since the negotiations began at the invitation of the Philippine government and the MILF. I think there's a lot of goodwill and commitment to continue to see it through, but there's also a lot of nervousness around whether or not the autonomy, which is the anchor of the agreement, is actually going to be realized and in what shape and form. So for an international, particularly the international states, international organizations like the Asia Foundation that I represent, the role is really to support this national journey towards a better outcome, a better situation, a better peace and stability for the region. And I think everyone recognizes that it's a support function for the international community. But in order to continue that support in terms of funding or in terms of technical assistance and so on, there needs to be a degree of confidence that the pathway that was laid out is being followed. So each of these junctures that stop or pause or discontinue things make it more difficult for people to justify that continued international investment. For example, on decommissioning, which is one of the points of contention between the government and the MILF, there's been no significant decommissioning for a couple of years because it's been caught up in the rest of these processes and discussions and negotiations. We really need to see all of the other aspects of the normalization process and the political process moving forward so that the international community continues to commit to it. I don't think there's any shortage of global support. If President Marcos or his administration called for international assistance, there are many states and international organizations that will continue to step up and contribute. But it needs to be with the signals that the pathway, the joint agreement that was laid out is being pursued.
Thank you so much, Sam. And finally, going back to Attorney Af. Attorney, beyond the legal debates, what steps should the Bangsamoro government take now to keep communities engaged and reassured that their voice and participation remain central to the democratic transition?
Whether elections push through or not, I think part of the role of the government is really make sure, one, that when we have storms coming, so just make sure services are still intact. But I think just connected to elections, the biggest thing that they have to do is to make sure people are actually aware. So I think the problem is there's still low awareness when it comes to the elections, the parliamentary process, and even the history of the peace process. So I think it's important for the Bangsamoro government to continue talking to communities, talking to people, to make sure that we're all working together to make sure everyone's informed, so that if elections push through on October 13, and it should, people are ready to vote who they want to actually vote for.
Thank you, Attorney Af. Before we end, we have an additional question for Ms. Miriam. Ms. Miriam, we need to ask this. So is there a tension between Chief Minister Makakua's camp and former Chief Minister Murad? And if there is a tension, how is the risk weakening MILF unity ahead of the 2025 BARM parliamentary elections?
Okay, you want a frank answer to that question?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, there's a tension, but the tension was not just something among themselves. We know how all this process started, right? Who's backing up the ICM right now? It's very clear. It's very clear who's backing up the ICM, even though in fact, most of the constituents of the MILF are still with MILF Chairman Murad and MILF Chair Iqbal. So that's the whole thing, and that's why this redistricting has been so complicated, precisely because of suspicion that one way or another it is intended to benefit one group, either of the two groups, and therefore the whole process has already been tarnished in really coming up with a 77, already tarnished by these dynamics that has been created under the stewardship of the peace office, where they have shown partisanship for one camp as against the other. So I think that really complicates the whole situation. But perhaps this is a short response to your question to Attorney Africa in relation to what must be done. The last thing that should happen here at this point is for violence to happen. That will be force majeure and justify COMELEC's rationale for stopping its preparation. So everybody should refrain from using violence. Let's hope no no underhanded violence actually happens to be blamed on anyone else to really create and intensify the crisis that the Bangsamoro is in now. So let's wait, let's see, let's take use this opportunity to continue, as you said, educating the people on the nuances of the election, but also at the same time expressing our position on this issue for especially for those who believe that the election should go on, then they have all the right to argue why that should be the case, whether on legal grounds or all of these possible political implications of further delaying the process of being able to institute a regularly elected Bangsamoro Parliament.
Thanks, Miss Miriam. Now, let's end with this question. Anyone can answer. Who wins here in this postponement? And on the other hand, who is the biggest loser? Anyone can answer.
Who's the biggest loser? The voters, the people whose voices are not being heard. At the moment, since the positive change in the passage of the law in 2018 and the plebiscite in 2019, there has not been an election. We've never once asked the people who do they want to represent them. And, we're 25, it's too long. That's why I think all of us are echoing that narrative that the elections need to go ahead. We will have an election. The question is when, and the sooner the better. Who is the biggest winner? Carlo is going to answer that.
I think no one wins.
Go ahead,
here,
Attorney.
I think no one wins here. I think there's just so much uncertainty. Again, we've been too used to postponements all over the Philippines. It's a bad thing for democracy. So I think it's really no one wins here. Whatever happens, it just makes things uncertain. It's just hard for people and organizations to prepare properly. And overall, if it's it hurts the peace process. It hurts democracy in the Philippines. It hurts the entire country, and even to other people all over the world that are looking at the peace process here. It also hurts that idea of like the peace process the peace process in Barm being a process that can be replicated in other parts of the world.
Thanks,
Attorney Af. Miss Miriam, go ahead and
I can
wrap up
only
this
agree.
question.
I can, I mean, I agree 100% with what Sam and Carlo just said. We all lose here if things turn from bad to worse. So as soon as possible, we hope that Supreme Court, perhaps on Monday, why don't you make a decision? Why don't you announce something, right? September 29, and then people can act. And all of these difficulties, not only the stakes are so high. You already have the whole country in upheaval on the corruption issues. You still have the challenge on the West Philippine Sea. And you have all of these other issues that, all of these little things going on. The last thing you need is violence in Mindanao, in the Bangsamoro. That's the last thing you need. So everyone should really be concerned about this. Let's have something decisive on September 29, please, Supreme Court. And then everything, then the legal process follows, right? That's all.
On that note, thank you so much to all of you for guesting in this episode tonight. Once again, we'd like to thank the chairperson of the Government of the Philippines Negotiating Panel, Ms. Miriam Coronel Fer. Thank you so much, ma'am. We also have our country representative of the Asia Foundation Philippines and member of the third-party monitoring team, Mr. Sam Chitik. And of course, the Director for BARM Reforms and Advocacy of Lente Philippines, Attorney Carlo Africa. Thank you so much. Maraming salamat po. Thank you for such a meaningful discussion on the importance of participating in the electoral process and the responsibility of each one in achieving safe, accountable, transparent, and inclusive elections. Once again, maraming salamat po.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jules.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so
Bye-bye.
much.
Salamat.
Maraming salamat.
All the
And
best.
we'd also like to thank our online viewers who tuned in to tonight's episode. I hope you all got meaningful takeaways from our discussion, which you may use in our purpose of monitoring and participating in the coming BARM elections. And of course, watch out for our upcoming episodes here on the social media pages of Lente Philippines. And of course, here are what watch out for in the coming months. First, the voter education activity, the Boto ng Bangsamoro campaign, led by COMELEC in partnership with various stakeholders, including Lente. For timely news on election and social issues, please stay tuned to Oras na Pilipinas, Dapat Pwede, every first and last Friday of the month from 8 o'clock to 8:30 a.m., which you can watch and listen on 702 DZAS FEBC Radio TV on terrestrial radio at 702 DZAS AM. And of course, check out also our next episode to our Kalentes, and always remember, may papel ka dahil sa atin ang eleksyon. Please stay tuned for the next episode. Once again, I'm Jules Ghiyang. Maraming salamat po and good evening and happy weekend to all of you.